You know what's constantly evolving and really demands our attention? National security.
Absolutely.
And recently, this whole concept of a Golden Dome missile defense system, the one proposed by President Trump, well, it's really thrown a spotlight on how nations might protect themselves in the future. Especially for those of you tracking current events, maybe with an eye on the UPSC exams. This is exactly the kind of, well, ambitious initiative we need to get our heads around.
It really is. And while missile defense itself isn't, new, the Golden Dome idea, at least as reported by our sources, it's aiming for a scale and complexity that, well, it marks a potential turning point.
Right.
It feels less like just tweaking things and more like a fundamental rethink of defensive capabilities.
Yeah, totally shift. And
Yeah.
to really get a solid grasp on this, we've been digging into reports from the Economic Times, Reuters, and NPR.
Good sources.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And one of the early things that really got people talking was that Reuters report about potential involvement from SpaceX,
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
which Elon Musk later kind of clarified or pushed back on X. But it just highlights how cutting edge the tech being considered really is.
It certainly does. And our goal here in this deep dive is really to unpack the core differences between the systems we know, like Israel's Iron Dome, for example.
Which is very effective in its own right.
Exactly. Between that and this much more ambitious Golden Dome concept, we want to equip you with a clear understanding of the technological leaps involved and the strategic shifts it represents.
Okay, sounds good. So let's start at the beginning, the genesis of this. Where did Golden Dome actually come from?
Well, our sources indicate President Trump directed the Pentagon to really take a fresh look, a significant reevaluation of missile defense strategies.
Okay.
The name itself, Golden Dome, seems to have popped up in one of his speeches, and then there was a subsequent executive order that kind of gave it the official push, exploring this really comprehensive system.
And the key feature, the one everyone's focusing on, that's the idea of intercepting missiles from space, right? Experts, the executive order, they all seem to point towards space-based interceptors.
That's the core of it, yes. And, to really appreciate what a jump this is, it's super helpful to contrast it with a system that has proven effective, but in a totally different context, Israel's Iron Dome.
Yeah, everyone knows about Iron Dome.
Yeah.
It's shown a remarkable ability to knock down short-range rockets. We've seen it in action.
We have. And its success really hinges on a network of ground-based radar, pretty sophisticated computer analysis, and its own interceptor missiles also launched from the ground.
Right.
However, and this is really the key distinction, our sources hammer home Iron Dome is specifically built for those short-range projectiles. It just doesn't have the capability to deal with longer-range missiles.
Oh, okay. That's where that analogy comes in, right?
Yeah.
Jeffrey Lewis comparing Iron Dome to a kayak and Golden Dome to a battleship.
Exactly. It instantly tells you the massive difference in scale and intended capability we're talking about.
Kayak versus battleship. Got it.
And a big reason for that difference is just the fundamental nature of the threats they're designed for. Iron Dome tackles threats coming from relatively nearby.
Okay.
The United States, though, has to think about the potential threat from long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, potentially, from nations like Russia or China.
And those are a whole different ballgame, aren't they? A completely different challenge.
Totally different. ICBMs, they're designed to travel huge distances. They actually go up into outer space and then come screaming back into the atmosphere at hypersonic speeds. We're talking several times the speed of sound.
That's incredibly fast.
It is. And that speed drastically cuts down the time you have to detect them, track them, and intercept them. It makes them exceedingly hard to hit with, traditional ground-based systems.
Right.
Plus, as Laura Grego from the Union of Concerned Scientists points out, the best time, the optimal window to try and intercept one is during its initial launch phase.
When it's slowest.
Relatively speaking, yes, and most vulnerable. But that phase only lasts about, 3 to 5 minutes?
3 to 5 minutes, that's nothing.
It's an incredibly short window.
So, okay, with such a tiny window, you have to get to the missile early, which logically leads to needing to be in space, right? The whole high ground idea we keep hearing about.
That's the thinking. If you put interceptors up in space, the idea is you can engage those missiles much earlier during that critical boost phase when they're, let's say, easier targets.
Makes sense.
Now, look, the idea of space-based missile defense, it's not brand new. People have talked about it for decades. But the practicalities actually doing it have always been, huge obstacle.
And Grego really highlights the logistical nightmare, doesn't she? The Earth is massive, satellites are whipping around. You'd need constant eyes on potential launch sites.
Precisely. She basically says you'd need a lot of things in space just to be sure you have a satellite in the right place at the right time to spot a launch and then intercept it.
A lot of things.
Yeah.
Like how many?
Well, the American Physical Society did an estimate. They figured you'd need something like 16,000 interceptors.
16,000?
Yeah, just to counter even a limited ICBM attack. It just underlines the monumental scale we're discussing. For you tracking this, it's key to understand this isn't just a minor upgrade. It's like an order of magnitude jump in the scale and complexity of missile defense.
16,000. Wow. I mean, that sounds almost impossible, fantastical. But then you think about what's happened recently, especially with SpaceX, launching thousands of Starlink satellites. Suddenly, maybe it's not so fantastical. The realm of possibilities seems to be shifting.
That's a really crucial point. The rise of these huge satellite constellations like Starlink, it does seem to open up new technological paths.
Right.
That Reuters report, even though Musk later clarified it on X, it mentioned a potential team-up, didn't it? SpaceX, Palantir, and Doral.
Yeah, for a constellation of hundreds of satellites, both sensing and attack ones.
Exactly. And even though Musk said, SpaceX is focused on Mars, he also said he'd be willing to help if the president directly asked, although he kind of suggested other companies might be better suited. It still hints that maybe this kind of deployment is becoming feasible.
And weren't there other proposals, too? Like Booz Allen Hamilton? They had a concept.
Yes, they proposed something a bit more modest, relatively speaking. Around 2,000 satellites, but these would be dual-role sensors and interceptors combined.
Okay, 2,000 is still a lot, but less than 16,000. What about the cost?
Well, according to Trey Obering, who was involved, they estimated about $25 billion total, including all the R&D.
$25 billion. That's significant. But Jeffrey Lewis, he was a bit more skeptical about those numbers, wasn't he?
He was. He suggested the actual costs, even for the Booz Allen system, could end up being quite a bit higher than that initial estimate. And maybe more importantly, he pointed out the ongoing costs, the constant financial burden of just maintaining a system like this.
Maintaining, you mean like repairs?
Sort of. Satellites in low Earth orbit, they gradually slow down and lose altitude because of tiny amounts of atmospheric drag. It's called orbital decay.
Right, I've heard of it.
So any space-based system like this, you'd constantly have to launch replacement satellites just to keep the constellation effective. He estimated that could cost like $4 to $5 billion every year just for upkeep.
$4 to $5 billion a year.
Yeah.
On top of the initial build cost.
Wow.
Wow. Okay, so huge potential undertaking, massive technological hurdles, enormous long-term costs. Let's pivot a bit to the why, the strategic thinking. Why do some experts, like Tom Carrico, see this as necessary?
Well, Carrico points to recent conflicts, in the Middle East, in Ukraine, and argues they just highlight how important strong missile defenses are becoming.
Okay.
He sees Golden Dome as a potential game changer, a powerful deterrent, not just against nuclear strikes, but maybe even against large-scale conventional wars with major powers like China or Russia, sort of raising the bar, making conflict less likely.
Raising the threshold for conflict, making adversaries think twice.
That's the idea.
But then, as always, you have the counter-arguments, the worries about how other countries might react.
Exactly. And this is where Jeffrey Lewis pipes up again with a major concern. The risk of kicking off a new nuclear arms race.
How so?
His worry is basically, if the U.S. really goes hard on developing Golden Dome, what do Russia and China do? They might feel they have no choice but to massively expand and upgrade their own nuclear arsenals.
To guarantee they can overwhelm the shield.
Precisely. Or maybe develop totally new kinds of crazy sci-fi weapons, as he puts it, designed specifically to beat a space-based defense.
And that U.S. intelligence assessment about Russia possibly testing space-based nukes designed to take out satellites? That seems pretty relevant here, doesn't it? Almost like a direct response.
It seems very relevant, yes. It really highlights the potential for escalation and just how vulnerable these expensive space assets could be.
It's a vicious cycle potential.
It could be. Lewis's bottom line is pretty pessimistic, actually. He thinks we could end up spending unimaginable amounts of money only to find ourselves in a worse, less stable strategic position than when we started.
So just to kind of wrap our heads around the core comparison again.
Yeah.
We're talking about maybe moving from the kayak Iron Dome, good for localized short-range stuff, to the battleship Golden Dome, aiming to stop the biggest, fastest threats, ICBMs, mainly using technology based in space.
That's the essence of it. The key differences really are the scale of the threat being addressed, the fundamental tech-needed ground-based versus this huge space infrastructure, and the strategic goals, from protecting a specific area to potentially shielding an entire nation and acting as a major global deterrent.
And thinking about this in the UPSC exam context,
Yeah.
understanding these different facets, the tech challenges, the eye-watering costs, the strategic arguments and counter-arguments,
Hmm.
it's absolutely vital for building a really well-rounded view on these big national security debates. Because there are just so many unanswered questions, aren't there? I mean, is it even truly feasible to build and maintain something this massive in space? What are the real costs going to be? And maybe the biggest question, how will it actually impact global power dynamics? Will it make conflict more or less likely? What level of risk, what financial burden is acceptable for this kind of security blanket, if it even works?
That's exactly the tightrope we're walking, isn't it? You've got this deep desire for better security using the most advanced tech we can imagine,
Right.
butting right up against the very real chance of unintended consequences, especially when you're talking about nuclear weapons and putting weapons or potential weapons in space. It really forces all of us to think hard about the long-term implications of these incredibly ambitious defense plans.
It certainly does. And it's a critical area for all of you, especially those preparing for the UPSC exams, to keep a close eye on. Definitely dig deeper into the sources we mentioned today. The Economic Times, Reuters, NPR, they offer really valuable different perspectives on this whole complex issue.
Good advice.
And hey, please do like, subscribe, and maybe drop a comment if you have more questions or thoughts on this. We're always keen to explore these crucial topics in more detail with you.